Good evening, everyone. It's Friday evening here. A very good afternoon and good morning to all those who are joining us from different time zones. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome our respected Principal, Reverend Brother Vincent Reddy, Vice Principal, Ms. Jayanti Reddy, our speaker for today's session, Dr. Matthew Friedman, eminent faculty, academicians, and students of prestigious institutions, my dear staff and students. I, Ms. Suvarna, your host for today, extend a very warm welcome to all of you for an international webinar on isolation and despair in a time of play, organized by the Department of English, Little Flower Degree College, Uppal, Hyderabad. We appreciate you for taking time off to join us today. We hope you will find this webinar to be engaging and fruitful. Before we begin, let us commence this webinar invoking the blessings of the Almighty. I invite Mr. Jay Sheelan, my colleague, to lead us into prayer.
Good evening, all. I want everybody to spend a few moments in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for plentiful graces bestowed on us and on our dear and near ones until this day. We especially thank you for the gift of life and its essence. We also thank you, God, for the speaker of today's webinar, Dr. Matthew Friedman. Bless him, God, and fill with your spirit as he is going to enlighten us with his knowledge and experiences. At this hour, we pray for your blessings and guidance in the matters at hand and ask that you would clearly show us how to carry out our work with a spirit of joy and enthusiasm. Give us the desire to find ways to excel in our work and help us to work together and encourage each other for the excellence of our students. We implore you to give strength to continue the best that we can be. Lord, in a particular way, we pray for the departed soul of Dr. Matthew Friedman's father, who breathed his last yesterday afternoon. We pray, Lord, that the everlasting life be given to unto him. We ask this in the precious name. Amen.
Thank you, sir. The COVID-19 has caused continued lockdown. As a result, all schools, colleges, and universities are closed down, but the online platform has made it possible for us to connect with each other and continue our learning. Let me say a few words about our college. Little Flower Degree College, Uppal is run by the Brothers of St. Gabriel Educational Society, a Christian minority college committed to the gospel values of equality, fraternity, freedom, and human brotherhood, striving to transform the society through the education mission. For the last 12 years, the Degree College, with its motto Lead to Illuminate, has been preparing the youth for life by promoting intellectual excellence, uprightness of character, and emotional maturity. Here is a virtual glimpse of our college.
Little Flower Degree College, Uppal, Hyderabad, a Montfort institute run by the Brothers of St. Gabriel Educational Society, has been illuminating the world around with its motto, Lead to Illuminate. In its 12 years journey of excellence, LFDC has been fostering the young generation to be humane and preparing them to compete, realizing their dreams and purpose in life on the competitive global platform.
Good educational environments, discipline,
practical skills helped me in getting my first job.
Excellent placement opportunities.
LFDC is an awesome college.
Dear parents and students, Little Flower Degree College, Uppal, Hyderabad has begun its admissions for the academic year 2020 and 21. The online application for the 3-year degree in BA, BSc, BCom and BBA is now available on our website.
Little Flower College.
LFDC
Little Flower Degree College.
Thank you. As we begin today's session, I request everyone to post their queries in the chat box. They will be attended to at the end of the session. We may not be able to take all the queries, but we'll find a way to attend to them. Thank you. The COVID-19 outbreak has affected all segments of the population. It has upended all areas of our lives and caused the most significant disruption to all our calendars. The continued lockdown has affected our sense of community and social gathering. The subsequent lockdown has made people resort to self-isolation. How do we cope with the adverse effects in such a time as this? To enlighten us on this, we have an eminent speaker with us. I invite Ms. Aishwarya, my colleague, to introduce our speaker for today.
There's some technical issue with Aishwarya. Suvarna, please you can continue.
Yeah, let me take the privilege. Vijay sir.
Yeah, please continue, sir.
Yeah. So it's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthew Friedman, the speaker of today's international webinar on responding to isolation and despair in the time of plague. Dr. Friedman is a professor and program director in Kingswood University in New Berksville on Canada's Atlantic coast. He has completed his PhD in intracultural studies and has taught in classrooms and field settings throughout the North America as well as in Asia, South America and Europe. On his particular focuses is trends of secularization in diaspora communities. He taught various courses, culture, anthropology, history of world Christianity, intracultural competencies, introduction to sociology, practical issues of cross-cultural preparations, spiritual conflict resolution, world religious, worldview are few of his list among the courses he taught. In addition to the number of articles, book chapters, and book reviews, he has published his monograph, Union with God in Christ. Also, he has done a comparative study of early Jewish, Christian, and Islamic approaches to the union with the divine. He enjoys great books and exploring world cultures. Little Flower Degree College welcomes you, sir.
Thank you so much. Um, I want to thank Reverend Brother Vincent Reddy and Mrs. P. Jayanti Reddy. I want to thank Ms. Suvarna, Ms. Aishwarya, even with the technical issues, and Mr. Jayashilan. These technical issues, those of us who have been teaching or learning during this COVID crisis have become our frequent companion and friend, so to speak. So I find that that the odd technical issue, if anything, makes the setting more familiar. I'm going to go ahead and try and upload my my PowerPoint. Okay, and I will assume that you all can see the PowerPoint. Just by way of prefatory remarks, I just want to say what a great opportunity this is. It's interesting and a little unusual that here I'm sitting in my own office at 7:45 in the morning in Atlantic Canada, in the province of New Brunswick, where our university is located. And you all are at about, I believe, 4:15, in mostly, at least, in India, although I believe that there are some who are beyond India itself, elsewhere in South Asia, and perhaps even beyond that. As we will see in a moment, some of this, my presentation on this topic especially, took a far more personal turn than I had been expecting, for reasons you'll understand in a few moments. So let me begin. In the beginning of March, during our university's spring break, my wife and I found ourselves with a multicultural group of our students visiting the great city of Toronto. For much of our time, we were engaged in interaction with international students from many nations, but I was drawn especially to students from various parts of India, as well as Bangladesh. Though I am originally from the United States, in fact, I lived in India for a number of years. My in-laws' home is in India, Shashar Ki Ghar, and I have found that when I am with Indian people, I feel like I am at home on some level. We don't have nearly as many Indian people in our part of Canada. We have some friends here, but in Toronto, it was everywhere. It was wonderful. During this visit, while the news of the spread of the coronavirus from China had something of which we were aware, it was not a primary concern. But this changed significantly shortly after our return to New Brunswick. Sorry, I have a PowerPoint. Shortly after our return to New Brunswick, when news arrived of the virus as having reached pandemic status. So within a short time, our university had to send our students home, as I'm sure did yours. We had to shift our classes online. And my own son, who is studying in the US, in the state of New York, had to come home. And his classes also went online, but from our house. Moving classes to Zoom has been easier for some than for others. Some have faced tragedy in this isolation and lockdown. I have a friend from Bangladesh who is a professor at another university in our province here. Our province of New Brunswick is actually, we are no longer on complete lockdown here, but our borders are shut. So the border with not only with the United States is shut, but our border with other provinces is shut to non-essential travel. So my friend, teaching at another university, he's from Bangladesh. his father expired. His father died during this crisis. And he was unable to travel and to be with family. And I grieved with him. I heard about this only really last week. I wrote him, I grieved with him. I was not able yet to see him. Of course, this is personal too. My own father, yesterday morning, less than 24 hours ago actually, I received word that my own father had died. And his funeral, of course, will be greatly delayed. And even then, I may not be able to go. So this has been, so talking on this topic is not just merely an abstract thing that I'm talking about other people, so to speak, but it's very personal for me. But, and while not all of you have experienced tragedy on the same level, and I certainly hope not, this is something that on some level we are, I think we are, as one looks at the video and looks at the feeds that people have, that where I could see people's faces, and people are in their homes, in their rooms, across India and indeed the world. There is a sense in which we are kind of together in our isolation, if you might say. So many are struggling with anxiety. Many are struggling with depression, stress. One recent study in the United States, my homeland, noted that a third of Americans polled are presently struggling with anxiety in the midst of the current coronavirus crisis, lockdowns, necessity of wearing masks in public, of social distancing. And I wonder what the corresponding figures may also be for other nations as well. For far too many people, this anxiety can begin to slip into despair amid the lockdown. So how might we address these, especially in a short presentation such as this one, right? In this brief presentation, I will offer a thumbnail sketch of two works of literature which provide perhaps glimpses into how we might understand and perhaps reframe our anxieties amid our isolation, and even recognize that we don't need to sink into despair. The two works of which we'll have a glimpse are Rabindranath Tagore's The Post Office and Soren Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death. Now, as most of those attending this presentation are located in South Asia, especially India, most of you will not need much of an introduction, I would imagine, to Rabindranath Tagore, to Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore, one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913, freedom fighter, not in the violent sense, but in the sense of very strong supporter of the freedom movement. He and his family were leaders of one branch of what was called the Brahmo Samaj. And although brilliant and a founder of his own university, Tagore's formal education was fairly limited. He did not complete his education in the UK. He was more of a non-traditional learner, and he sought, in a sense, in the founding of his University of Shantiniketan, of Vishwabharati at Shantiniketan, he sought to model kind of a model of education that would go beyond merely traditional models. Some of that is quite appreciated. Now, Tagore's play, Dakhar, or The Post Office, made quite a mark when it was first published and performed, both in its original Bengali and in English translation. The preface to the published version of this translation was written by famed Irish poet W.B. Yeats, who noted the spiritual emphasis in the drama. It has a bit of a history too. It was a version of it in French was performed on the radio in France as the Nazis were invading France, kind of as a sense of comfort, I suppose. There was also in the Warsaw Ghetto, as many of the people there, and primarily Jews, were surrounded and in desperate straits for their lives. Someone organized a performance of the post office. So it's got a bit of traction. It's got a bit of a life to it. And as you can see in the PowerPoint, it even made an appearance on a postal stamp. Now the post office is set in a Bengali village setting, in which a character named Madhav, or in the Bengali it's Madhav Dutta, is caring for Amal, his nephew, who is deathly ill. The traditional doctors, in Bengali they're referred to as Kobiraj, insist that Amal's recovery depends upon his remaining shut up indoors. Does that sound familiar to you? And though they quote from sacred texts, there is a sense in which they don't really understand what is going on with him. In fact, there is a sense throughout the post office, throughout Dhakkar, that of suspicion with mere book learning, not only with the Kobiraj, the village doctor, but even with Madhav or Madhav Datta himself. Madhav Datta, there's a sense in the text, it's a very simple play, really. Quite a contrast with Kierkegaard in its simplicity, but there's a sense in which even Madhav himself is not greatly educated, but he has a desire that Amal would eventually receive a deep education. Now Amal is at this point in the play, he is non-literate. He cannot read. We don't know how old he is. He's probably quite young. Yes. So in his confinement, Amal longs for the outside, to travel and to be free, to explore. Madhav Datta there's a relative or a friend, a relation in the English translation of the play. He's referred to as the gaffer, basically kind of an English slang for old man. In the Bengali, it's Thakurda. It's basically grandpa. But as you all would know, that's Thakurda. That sort of language is not only direct relations, but it's an honorific given to someone of a certain age. I know my wife is from Karnataka, and so in the Kannada context, Ajja and Aji would be used in a similar sort of way. Now this relative is somewhat mischievous and playful, and later he appears disguised as a fakir. And when he speaks with some of those who pass by his window, that is when Amal speaks with some of those who pass by his window, such as the watchman, the curd seller, the girl Sudha who gathers flowers, he vividly imagines where they are from and describes village scenes in detail, things he could not have seen really with his own eyes. He inquires about an impressive building across the street and across the village, and is informed that it is the post office. The post office is owned by the king, and those who work there travel far and wide delivering letters. Amal begins to imagine receiving a letter from the king himself. Now the gaffer, who has been feeding Amal's thirst for adventure, listens to Amal describe the route the postman will take with his letter from the king, and states, he says, "My eyes are not young, that is the gaffer, the takoda, the ajak, the old man. He says, my eyes are not young, but you make me see all the same. Amal has an ability to see beyond the confines of his present situation. Though he is confined, he has a mind which is able to roam far and wide. Though his body must remain indoors, his mind roams free. And this too, with no internet and no video games, right? Amal states that he is not sad, but then he says, he's asked actually the gaffer, the takoda, he says, why are you sad? He says, it isn't sad. This is Amal speaking. He says, it isn't sad. When they shut me in here, first I felt the day was so long. Since the King's post office, I like it more and more being indoors, as I think I shall get a letter one day. I feel quite happy, and I don't mind being quiet and alone. He doesn't feel sad, because he sees the reality beyond the one just before his physical eyes. One of the characters in the play, the village headman, notifies the king in an attempt to cause trouble, to embarrass Madhav and his family. He later comes with a blank piece of paper to mock Amal. And he says, here's your letter from the king. But the king, and the letter says, I'm coming to your house. But in fact, the king is truly on his way. Ultimately, the king comes to take his new postman as Amal passes away. And flowers from Sudha, the flower girl, are gently pressed into his hand. It ends on a little bit of a wistful, melancholy note in a way. But there's also a sense of hope, that it's not merely that. Now for Tagore, there is a deep spiritual thread running through all of his works. In a recent article in the Kolkata Statesman on the usefulness of Tagore's writing in the midst of the current pandemic, Sukalyan Chanda writes that Tagore's distinctive spirituality was grounded in his personal interpretation of the Upanishadic conception of the divine that is that is immanent in the entire cosmos. Each being is part of this eternal and all-encompassing entity. Now, for the purposes of this short presentation, let me emphasize the idea that all-encompassing entity is also immanent with us at all times, and in some ways not dependent upon our mere book learning. But as with Amal is this innocent, endlessly curious, imaginative, yet not yet literate young boy. His learning is not confined, our learning, especially in the presence of the one who is there, is not confined merely to those who have learned literature. And of course, there's other layers of symbol running through the post office. For example, there's a professor from Jaipur University, Shalini Yadav, who some years ago published a journal article on the symbolic nature of a political interpretation of this play. But we're not going to go there today. I mention it only to note that there are layers of meaning. But this theme of inner spiritual freedom amidst confinement is our focus here. And Amal is thus our example. And this ties in a way, with our second author, Søren Kierkegaard, the early 19th century philosopher. Kierkegaard is sometimes referred to as the father of existentialism, though he has both commonalities and significant differences of the later existentialists. One key distinction is that between Kierkegaard and the later existentialists, as we will see, is that Kierkegaard was a committed Christian in the sense that For the later existentialists, meaning was something one had to generate in the face of otherwise a nihilistic situation, a meaningless situation. Whereas for Kierkegaard, meaning was already there, but it's a matter of connecting with that in one's own experience. So there is a little bit of a distinction, but it's an important, one might even say ontological distinction between the understanding that Kierkegaard had and those of some of the later existentialists. A well-known element of his philosophy is the idea of taking a leap of faith, if you will, of recognizing that one's reason can only take one to a certain point, beyond which one may need to proceed on the strength of the absurd, even to the point of imitating the figure who Kierkegaard holds up as a knight of faith, the biblical prophet Abraham, who in both the Bible, in the biblical book of Genesis and in the Quran, Surat Ibrahim, is depicted as being directed by God to offer up his son as a sacrifice to God. And he obeys. He takes his son up to the mountain to do the deed, and at the last moment, God stops him and says, now it's clear that you have faith in me and obey me in everything, and provides a substitute. Now there are differences between minor differences really between the way that the Bible and the Quran actually depict this. The Bible names that son as Isaac. The Quran does not name the son. But it's this idea of Abraham being willing, even though it makes no sense to him, he's willing to turn himself fully to God. Now, in his book, The Sickness Unto Death, is regarded as a work of psychology as well as philosophy. Within this work, and I'm really only going to be, in this particular work, I'm really only going to be examining the first part of it. Again, just for the sake of time, we're quite limited with our time today. Within this work, Kierkegaard addresses especially the temptation to despair. And it is despair that Kierkegaard sees as the sickness unto death itself, but he defines this in a very distinct manner. In this particular work, like Kierkegaard's writing generally, it's not easy reading. He can be quite dense in his writing style. And one often needs to work through a passage slowly in order to really parse what the author means to tell us. There's some real riches to be gained, however, in undertaking this journey into Kierkegaard. But in this very brief treatment, again, I'm going to just focus on the very first part of this particular book. As it is, I'm taking two different. I'm looking at two different works, and so we're going to necessarily be limited in terms of what we cover. Now, at the heart of Kierkegaard's understanding of despair is his concept of self, of the self as a kind of synthesis between the physical and the spiritual part of what it means to be human. Now, in some understandings, this has been modified or understood as physical and mental or psychological. One source I looked at for this presentation was a paper. It was actually a master's thesis on Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death as psychology for somebody who was who is studying and researching counseling. So a key element of this is that one is not really a full self without both the physical and the spiritual. Part of his idea is that the self is in effect a relationship between the physical and spiritual parts of oneself. In view of the tension between finitude and infinitude, of necessity and possibility. And when these are out of balance, they lead to despair, because despair for Kierkegaard is not merely this sense of depression, but a lack of faith. An imbalance, a disruption, in which the physical, that is that idea, that element of finitude or necessity, is overemphasized at the expense of the spiritual, that is infinitude or possibility. Or vice versa. Sometimes it can be the opposite problem. Sometimes it's the spiritual is overemphasized at the expense of the physical. Both held in tension, of course, are central to Kierkegaard's thought. And he sees the solution to this as faith in, for Kierkegaard, the resurrected Jesus, as the one in whom this synthesis of spiritual and physical is perfected. He says, and Kierkegaard's quite direct in this, in regard to what this means for prayer in the midst of this. And this, personally, I have found helpful in the midst of my own grief at this present time. He says, so to pray is to breathe. Possibility is for the self what oxygen is for breathing. But for possibility alone or necessity alone to supply the conditions for the breathing of prayer is no more possible than it is for a man to breathe oxygen alone or nitrogen alone. For in order to pray, there must be a God, and there must be a self plus possibility, or a self and possibility in the pregnant sense. For God is that all things are possible. And that all things are possible is found only within God, basically catching his meaning. And only the man whose being has been so shaken that he became spirit by understanding that all things are possible, only he has had dealings with God. The fact that God's will is the possible makes it possible for me to pray. If God's will is only the necessary, man is essentially as speechless as the brutes, merely physical. So for Kierkegaard, now part of what is needed to understand is for Kierkegaard, a good deal of what Kierkegaard's writings were involved were a critique of his society at the time. A good deal of what Kierkegaard's writing and philosophy involved was a critique and of the nominal and what he considered folk religious, false Christianity of his society in his day. That many people were going through the motions of having some sort of Christian faith, but in fact had no real Christian faith, had no real relationship with God, did not pray except going through the motions in that sense. And in that sense, it circles back to even Tagore's critique of his own society. In the post office in Bhakur, we see that in the beginning, the Kobiraj, the village doctor, is bringing a folk remedies for his patient Amal. And he's quoting liberally from the Shastras, from his version of the scriptures. But he does not actually understand what is happening with Amal. It is only when the royal physician of the king comes in, he says, why is he kept up here merely in this house? Open the windows, open the doors, let the air in. In a sense, it's the futility of folk religion, the futility of of mere nominal adherence to faith, as opposed to the reality of true faith, of true joining oneself with the divine. Now, what does this mean for us who are now confined, yet seeking to go beyond ourselves? Not merely sunken into despair of one sort or another in our lockdown, nor for us to be with such a lack of grounding that we fail to care for those who are suffering in the midst of this crisis, whether that is the poor migrant workers in parts of South Asia, or African Americans who are suffering from police brutality in the United States. How is it that we respond not only inwardly, but how is it that we respond outwardly as well, to those with whom we find ourselves, to those with whom we at least find ourselves in communication, say via Zoom, right? To circle back to the beginning, of course, this has been very personal for my family and I. This presentation changed in the last 24 hours. I'll let you know that. My father has died, and I was not able to see him in his final illness, nor will I be able to complete the rites for him until perhaps many months from now. I am, just so to lay my cards on the table, my own spiritual location. I am Jewish, but I believe in and follow Jesus, as did Kierkegaard. And but I continue to follow and apply many of the traditions of my Jewish culture. And so we have prayers, basically they're prayers of praise to God in the Aramaic language that I pray, I will be praying every day this week. But I will not be praying them with other family members. I will not be praying them at a funeral in the presence of my father, at least his body. This is hard. What does one do? Our family is talking about having some sort of virtual memorial service, perhaps utilizing Zoom in a manner similar to that which we are using here. As people of faith, we can pray, recognizing with both Tagore and Kierkegaard that God's presence can never be confined, even if we are. And as we are strengthened inwardly, we can reach out to others. A colleague of mine, actually the wife of a colleague of mine, she's also my colleague, actually. The husband is a professor colleague of mine here at Kingswood University. The wife is actually an administrator here. She has been away from her office for the last couple of months because she had a tumor. And she finally, in the midst of the lockdown, she was not able even to go for surgery for her tumor. Finally, this past week, things lifted enough. And here in our province of New Brunswick, currently we have no active cases of COVID-19. So they're beginning to lift things a little bit within the province, though one will face difficulty if one leaves in coming back. And so she was able to go and have her surgery earlier this week, and someone set up a list of those who could provide meals for she and her husband. And my wife and I had signed up to provide the meal for them yesterday, the day that we received the news about my father. But we had a commitment to be a blessing to our friends. And so even in the midst of our grief, we prepared foods. And my colleague, who had written and said, "No, you don't need to do this. I understand." We said, "No, we need to do this." because you are also in difficulty. And so we prepared food, and my colleague came over and picked up the meal that we had presented to them with gratitude. We have a growing population of refugees in our town here in Eastern Canada. And we're looking for creative ways to reach out to them and continue language classes even via electronic means. So this inner connection that we have with the Creator, even in the midst of our confinement, hopefully then motivates us not only toward an inner connection with the Almighty, but also motivates us to move out in whatever way we can in serving others as well. And I suppose that's a little part of what I'm seeking to do here. What I'm seeking to do here. So when we think of freedom in the midst of suffering, you think of the gentleman pictured there, Mahatma Gandhi and Gurudev Tagore. You think of those pictured there, they were seeking freedom in the midst of suffering, but not only political freedom, but also looking for how does that emerge from a spiritual type of freedom, an inner type of freedom. What does this mean? Again, not merely sinking into despair, but enabling that connection with the Almighty and reaching out to others, even in the midst of this crisis. Thank you for taking time to be part of this seminar. And I think in view of my present circumstances, our question time will be a little shorter than had originally been envisioned. But I think we will nonetheless continue with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the chat box here. Many of them are expressing their condolences, and they are also very happy with the presentation, which is very informative and encouraging. And looks like there are no questions as of now. And there is one here. What do you think about the untimely?
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing.
Let me read it.
Yeah.
Give me a second, please. What do you think about the untimely death of the people who have faith upon God? Do you mean to say that it is the will of God?
That's a bigger question than we probably have time to answer now. I think we get into problems, I think, if we assume that everything that takes place is necessarily the will of God, that all suffering is somehow the will of God. Philosophically, I would pin that on what is sometimes called the free will argument, that God has made us with a measure of free will, that God could have created us. He could have made us as robots, right? That just automatically kind of do everything exactly as we're meant to. But instead, he chose to make us with a certain measure of free will. Free will means that bad things can happen, that people can do things that they ought not to do, which, as we've seen around the world, happens. Sometimes there are consequences to that. Sometimes there are larger consequences to that. There's been some suggestion that even the COVID epidemic, while the virus itself is not made by people, the fact that it mushroomed into a pandemic was partly because of the irresponsibility of people, political leaders in the part of the world where it first emerged. So I will not say that everything, that if someone suffers an untimely death, it is the will of God. I will say, and this is I want to be careful how I state this. When one drives, one has a GPS sometimes. Come to rely on those things now. And if one, perhaps one misses a turn, the GPS, the global positioning system, adjusts itself and changes the route to arrive at the destination. So sometimes circumstances change. Sometimes an untimely death. When I think of, now my father was 85 years old and he had a long confinement and he was sick for months. So it was not a surprise that my father died. 2 years ago, my brother died, my younger brother, 10 years younger than I. We had just come back from Chicago, from a similar trip that I took with students to Toronto just now. I took students to another trip to Chicago. Again, mostly we were in a part of Chicago that's like a little India. We had a lovely time. We came back. The day after I came back, the phone rang, and it was my mother. And she said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "Just go ahead and tell me." She said, "Your brother is in the hospital. He has had a stroke." This is 10 years younger than I, 43 years old. And I ended up going down to Florida, flying to Florida. There was no COVID to prevent me from doing so, where my brother was located. He was in the hospital, tubes, everything. He had a young daughter. He seemed like he might slowly recover. I came back to Canada and I was on a break. I was teaching a class and I felt my phone vibrate. And during the break in the middle of class, I looked at my phone and I saw it was a text from my mother informing me that my brother had had another subsequent stroke and now was completely unresponsive. I traveled back to Florida again. At that point, mostly just to be with my mother and to pray for my brother. And came back, and a few days after I came back, my brother expired. Now, in that particular instance, that was unlike my father's death. This was an untimely death, as the questioner described. And it was really hard. Harder in a way than this was. And part of it related to choices that my brother had made. Poor choices, frankly, that my brother had made. And so there's factors that go in to, say, an untimely death beyond merely the will of God. I think God's will is he desires to bless all people. He is drawing all people to himself. That's the idea of, in my belief system, that would be the idea of grace. That God's presence is everywhere, as both Tagore and Kierkegaard would have noted. But that God's presence, God's uncreated presence, is drawing people to himself. Of course, whether people respond to that or not is another matter. Long answer to a short question. Sorry.
Yeah. One more here.
Mm-hmm.
Can we call the person who took leap of faith an existentialist crisis or an existentialist hero? How can faith help us?
Well, that kind of branches off of Kierkegaard's idea of Abraham as a knight of faith. Now, none of us is going to be faced with quite the decision that Abraham is faced with, right? because we have Abraham's prior example. And so that doesn't get repeated. But I think sometimes the way Kierkegaard put it is he said it is kind of a leap of faith on the strength of the absurd. It's inwardly, intuitively that something is correct, is right, on the basis of faith, even apart from what seems to be a logical course. And so you decide to make that move. I think the one thing I will add to Kierkegaard, right? That sounds pretentious. The one thing I will add to that is how do I put this? As someone who studies theology as well as intercultural studies, and theology is part of the mix of what I do. I become suspicious of any theological system that eliminates the element of mystery, that has everything so down to a logic to the point in which it seems like, or it appears as though, all logical holes have been plugged. I don't think God quite lets us get away with that. I think I think there's a certain degree to which we must look to him in faith. And so that idea of a leap of faith, in our existentialist crisis, that is, say an existential crisis might be what we are all dealing with now, right? In COVID, perhaps some of you have lost family members. There's a large group of people in this session. There's nearly 400 people in this session. So I'd actually be surprised if there is nobody in this session who has also lost someone in the midst of this crisis. And my condolences, my heart goes out to you if you're in that boat, if you're one of those people. But it's in the midst of our existential crisis that we realize that unlike some of the other existentialists where one must establish meaning for oneself, there is meaning established for us anyway. And that leap of faith is a matter of connecting with that meaning in the Almighty. If I may put it like that. Again, this is any of these questions could be the subject, and sometimes in some settings are the subject of an entire course or an entire book in and of itself. Multiple volumes have been written on these very complex questions, and so it's kind of, to quote Kierkegaard, it's with fear and trembling that I even seek to respond to a question like that. In such a brief time period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. And probably the last one here.
Sure.
Knowing it fairly well that life is the most pleasant lie and death is the ultimate truth. We love and cherish life and hate death. How will you define the concept of life and death, sir?
Sure. Again, this is not a question. This is not a question that one can really thoroughly answer in a session such as this. But I would say we ought not to separate death and life in that sense. And I think life is not. The questioner said something to the effect of, and correct me if I misheard this, life is the great lie and death is the great truth. Is that correct?
Yeah.
But life is not the great lie. it's not merely a proving ground either. For Kierkegaard, the opposite of despair is not, and he sees despair as sin, frankly. The opposite of despair or sin is not virtue, but it is faith. It is looking to God, looking to the Almighty, and that faith, not merely for what happens after one dies, but that faith for this life itself. That for Kierkegaard, certainly, and to a degree, I think I can say for Tagore, there's a degree to which it is not that this life is not merely illusory, but is real. And as we look in that faith, in that leap of faith, if you like, toward the Almighty, this life itself connects us in a uniting type of a way with the divine. And again, for Kierkegaard and for myself, I mean, this is in Jesus. I don't make an apology for that. In the sense that even it is written in the Bible, in the New Testament, it says, he who, there is no fear in love, because fear has to do with punishment. But he who loves does not face judgment, but is passed from death to life. So there is a sense in which life itself, life in the fullest sense, in the sense of God's very self and God's very presence, has broken in to our reality, existentially, if you like, has broken into our reality and offers himself to us. Doesn't merely demand the offering of ourselves to him, but offers himself to us, that by uniting ourselves with him, his life flows into us. It's actually quite remarkable. So the meaning of death and life, in a sense, becomes intertwined in a way. That's a very short and inadequate answer to a very deep question, so I apologize for that. If I were in Hyderabad now and we were all on campus now, we could take a few hours and have tea and chops and maybe some other items together, but we're not in that position now, for which I have regrets.
Thank you so much for the thought-provoking session. There are a lot of messages here expressing condolences, and also there are some more questions. If possible, we can get them through WhatsApp or mail.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I really appreciate the questions, the good questions, actually, the thoughtful questions. But I think yeah, maybe if the dialogue can continue, maybe at a slower pace. I think following this, to be honest with you, I'm connecting with my Lord in my own existential crisis at the moment. And I think I'm going to need to have just time to myself and with my family and with my God. And yeah, but with gratitude, even without going into details. I've already probably overshared a bit, but without going into details, gratitude for things that seem to have happened even with my father, from whom I had a long period of estrangement some years ago. Some good things which happened with my father, maybe just in the last few weeks before he expired. So perhaps as your questions, I'm sure Ms. Suvarna will collect those questions Um, I can't promise you I'll answer all of them. And I certainly cannot promise you that I'll answer them in a timely manner, especially right now. But I would actually welcome discussions. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing from your personal experiences, making it relevant to the situation that we all are in. Thank you everyone for your active participation. We have come to the end of our session. I invite Mr. Jaishiran to express words of gratitude.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Gratitude is a memory of heart. An old French proverb by Jean-Baptiste Monsieur. He says, I know we all heard many times that we should be thankful and show gratitude throughout our lives. Whether it is as simple as thank you for a gift received, or as a dramatic or a heartfelt prayer when a miracle has happened in our lives. Both can be emotional experiences. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, honorable speaker of today's webinar, respected principals, vice principals, professors, HODs, and faculties of various departments of diverse institutions. I, Jay Shilan, on behalf of the English Department of Little Flower Degree College, take privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. Firstly, I thank God for the time which He has gifted to each one of us to learn and later contribute for the better future. Secondly, I extend a heartfelt thanks to our honorable speaker, Dr. Matthew Friedman, who has blessed us with his presence and took out valuable time of his busy schedule in despair moments of his father's passed away. And he has put the topic, the isolation and despair in a time of plague, to have faith in God and nowhere to blame others for what is happening around us. Thank you, Dr. Matthew Friedman.
Thank you.
Next, I also wish to thank and express my gratitude to our principal, Reverend Brother Vincent Reddy, and our vice principal, Mrs. Jayanti Reddy, for providing constant support and encouragement for the success of this international webinar. Thank you, brother and madam. I heartily congratulate and thank all the participants, both from overseas and India, for their active participation in this event. Thank you, participants. Also, I would like to extend a special thanks to Mr. Vijay and Mr. Raman for supporting technically and non-technically throughout this webinar. Thank you, Mr. Vijay and Mr. Raman. I'm also very grateful and thankful to our Little Flower Degree College HODs of all the departments and the staff for their valuable suggestions in organizing this event. Thank you all HODs and staff of my college. Finally, as no program can be successful with a single person, so I extend my big thanks to Ms. Suvarna, my HOD, and Ms. Aishwarya, my colleague, for their tireless hard work and support for making this event more memorable and meaningful. Thank you guys for making this event successful with your dedication. Thank you all once again for the great participation. Let's fight Corona, staying home, and taking necessary safety measures for safe life. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Truly, it has been an honor to have Dr. Matthew Friedman to enlighten us on this topic during such a time as this. He has lost his father yesterday. Despite that, he was committed to what he has promised. We express our deepest and heartfelt condolences to his family and stand with them in prayer for God to comfort him. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. It's been our pleasure to host this webinar. The link for e-certificate is provided there. Please fill up the feedback form and you will get the certificate. Let us be people of faith, be strengthened and reach out to those hurting. Thank you. Have a good evening and have a good day. Stay safe.
you.